Hello, welcome back. Um, this Unit 3, we are going to start with a discussion about classical Greece and classical Greek art. And in this whole unit, the discussion about classical Greek art and architecture will then also lead into a discussion about sculpture, talking about kind of history and comparative history of sculpture, and we'll also then lead to talking about form and mass and space towards the end of the unit. But for now, we're just covering the art historical stuff here online. And so this is a very brief overview of classical Greek art. And um, I would strongly recommend that you, in your reading, but also in looking at the videos on the playlist, kind of expand your knowledge. To give you one example, there are lots of Khan Academy pieces about many of the specific pieces we cover kind of briefly in this lecture. But there's also a great Khan Academy piece about the three main orders of Greek architecture and things like that. So, as you can see from the title page of this lecture and the brief outline of what we're going to cover, the first thing we're going to be discussing is why did this happen? Why was classical Greece, the Periclean age, so special? What happened to lead to this kind of moment? And why was the art of this period and of this region so special? And how did we get from that archaic period to the classical period? And then later on, we'll talk about the Greek orders of architecture, and we'll talk about architecture, sculpture, and then leading into discussions about what's the difference between Hellenic and Hellenistic art. Um, but that will actually come in the second and third part. So for now, just the discussion of how did we get from there to here. If you remember, last unit we covered a lot of history going from the very ancient periods of like the beginning of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, all the way to what we referred to as the Archaic or the Axial period, which, as I described, was a period dominated by empires, a period where we left off was dominated by the Persian Empire, and the world at that point looked like it was, and moving towards ever increasingly large empirical states and more efficiently run top-down type organization. And societies like the Greeks were on the periphery and seemed like they were going to be ever more on the periphery of those large empires. And then something changed. And so part of what we're going to be talking about is why did those things change. Um, and so I have a couple of reasons to discuss, and of course the main thing to cover is that no one knows for certain, but definitely these reasons are strong key suspects. And one of them was that the growing importance of the Mediterranean, of trade in the Mediterranean. As I mentioned in class, the Persian Empire was obsessed with roads, and road travel and road commerce in the age of empires was extremely important. But what was happening in the Mediterranean was that the transport of goods was getting to a point in boats where it was competing against um, and leading to a much higher rate of transport of goods, much higher rate of commerce, so that seafaring was becoming more important than the movement on roads. And so these small kind of semi-independent groups of people, including the Greeks, who were dominating the Mediterranean travel and Mediterranean commerce, all of a sudden were becoming more important. And then, of course, a major important reason about the change of this world was that the Greeks did win. There was a war between the Greeks and the Persians, and the Greeks did both win independence and eventually fully defeat the Persians. And if they hadn't won, the history that we're talking about might be quite different. What made the Greek culture so important? Because we look back at this classical period, and the Greek classical period pretty much sets the kind of a standard. It's kind of everything else is based off of it. That the Hellenistic world is based off of the Hellenic Greek world, and then the Roman is based off of that. And then through the Roman Empire, we have all of this Greek influence in every parts of our culture of the modern world. And and one of the things that I think one of the reasons why the Greeks were so successful at making a culture that was so influential was because the Greek culture itself was so willing to absorb influences from other places and to recombine them into new ways. Um, and then also that the Greek culture was, as I described, skeptical, adventurous, and competitive. And we see this kind of um, approach to life, not just in their commerce and their seafaring, but in their approach to mathematics and to philosophy and to art. And this willingness to push, to compete, to keep outdoing each other, um, was definitely a large part of why the art that came out of this 300-year period seemed to so be so special and so influence the world. As I said earlier, the Greek city-states were decentralized. They were kind of in some ways a revert to an old form of government, the city-state form of government, very similar to what we saw in ancient Sumeria. But because they were these decentralized city-states, and this also led to the same idea of competition, the city-states were united at times, especially when it came to common defense, but otherwise were often, once again, trying to outdo each other. So the whole society, both within individuals, between city-states, between different groups within a city, was very much organized around a kind of a collegial sense of competition, although sometimes not so collegial. Um, the Greek city-states were very much focused on private commerce. The big empires were also interested in wealth and in commerce, but their approach was top-down and state-controlled. And the Greek city-states were much more organized around the idea of letting people have the freedom to expand their business how they saw fit. And so, because of all those reasons, they grew wealthy and powerful. And and we'll never know fully the reason why the Greeks became so important to the history of the world. To a certain degree, they're important to the history of the world because they were important to the history of the world. Like that, their influence is self-fulfilling in a way. Um, that it quite easily could have been other groups. We could be living in a world today heavily influenced by the culture of the Phoenicians, where the Greeks are just a side note. But it's not the way history played out. And one of the things that the Greeks are most widely acclaimed for is their architecture. Definitely the Romans loved Greek architecture and borrowed heavily from and kind of systematized Greek architecture. And right here in this slide, I'm showing you both kind of like the basis of some of the forms. There are three basic classical forms of architecture, the three orders: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Actually, all the images we're looking at here are the oldest and most traditional of those orders, the Doric. But we're also seeing a shift from the archaic kind of period where the architecture was very heavy, very much about looking like it bears weight, and very solid and conservative feeling in lots of different ways. And then we move towards the classical period where even the Doric order lightens up and becomes more airy. And but one of the things I want to say about the Doric order right now is that the Doric order, even in the Parthenon, is always about the bearing of weight. In a way, I guess all Greek architecture is about that idea of conveying and making clear to the person experiencing the space about that the building is holding the weight and how it's holding the weight. And as we talk about the Greek orders some more in the next part, we will cover that even further. Thank you.